to see you all here. I'm going to turn it over now to Jan Jensen, who is the president of RCLLG, to welcome our guest speaker this morning. Jan?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Mary. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending the annual Ramsey County Local League of Governments annual meeting here on December 4th. And today it is my privilege for our program to introduce David Schultz. David Schultz is a Hamline University professor of political science who teaches across a wide range of American politics classes, including public policy and administration, campaigns and elections, and government ethics. David is also a professor in the Hamline and University of Minnesota Schools of Law, where he teaches election law. David is the author of 30 books and 100 plus articles on various aspects of American politics, election law, the media, and politics in the media. He is regularly interviewed and quoted in local, national, and international media on these subjects. So please welcome David Schultz, and we're so happy that you could join us today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. And as I'm looking across there, I recognize many names here. So it's great to see a bunch of old friends and acquaintances. And probably if I was going to add only one more thing to my to the wonderful bio that you read, I would have pointed out that, you know, most of my career when it was sort of working in government was in local government. Now I'm going to tell you what I did, and you're going to either question my sanity or have respect for me. I used to be a director of planning, zoning, and code enforcement, which meant I used to deal with not just the usual planning stuff, but all the arranges many of you know in local government with what? Dogs, garbage, snow, and stuff like that. And believe it or not, I actually love that job. I love the job of solving people's problems on a day-to-day basis. And so you'll either think I'm nuts because I did that or have respect for me. I'll let you make that decision yourself. But what I want to do today is a few different things. You know, obviously, I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers because I think one of the most interesting parts of sort of presentations like this has been the Q&A. And I've done this, I think, for you at least 2 or 3 times over the last few years. And so that'll be the fun part. But I've got several major themes that I want to talk about today in terms of the 2020 elections. And I'm not going to talk about just the 2020 elections, but as I repeatedly mentioned to my students, for example, this semester, I'm teaching an introductory American politics class. And when we got to discussion of voting, you know, of course, a lot of my students will say, well, why should I vote? It doesn't matter, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll say to them, well, whatever you may think about that, elections do have consequences, you know, and what happens after elections is tremendously important. And people forget that. So I want us to think a little bit about, you know, what are some of the consequences of the election. So my themes today, I want to talk about. One of them, it's going to be about this whole notion of what I call it being a very divided nation, in the sense that my simple summary right now is that we entered the election as a very divided country, and we exited the election very divided. And that unfortunately is true at the Minnesota level, because part of my talk today will obviously go between national and Minnesota. So one is the theme about being a divided nation. 2, I'm going to point out and say that the 2020 elections are not quite over, but they're close. And I'll explain what I mean by that. 3rd, I want to talk about what I call the polling and prediction machines. And what I mean by that, many of you were probably, like everybody else, looking at the polls, looking at people like Nate Silver, 538, and all those sites before the election, trying to sort of get a sense of what's going to happen. I want to talk a little bit about that. And then what I think will be the biggest surprise for you for today, I'm going to argue that despite everything that's happened in the last, let's say, 9 months since approximately March, that the 2020 elections unfolded in an entirely predictable way. And you're going to say, what do you mean by that, Schultz? And I'll explain. And then, of course, we need to look forward. We shouldn't just be looking backward to what happened, but to try to understand something about what all this is going to mean statewide, and what it's going to mean at the local government level, and of course at the national level, going into 2021 and beyond. So those are the major themes that I want to address. And of course, I hope that you folks have lots of good questions for me. And I'm willing, by the way, as I'm speaking, to take questions as I go, whether through chat or whether you want to unmute your microphone, whichever you're more comfortable with. And so I'd like to, as much as possible, if we can keep this a little bit interactive also. All right, so in terms of starting with the first theme, that we're a very divided nation. In a much longer discussion than I would have today, I would do a far more detailed discussion about partisanship and polarization in American politics. And I know for the last few years, one of the most recurrent questions that is brought to me, or people have an observation and say to me something to the effect of, Professor Schultz, isn't this the most divided we have ever been in American politics? And I'll pause and say, well, no. When Abraham Lincoln got elected in 1860, Fort Sumter, there was a firing on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War started. That beats the heck out of it. And then for some of us, it might be, and for me, at the very, very early part of my life, in the early 1960s, when I was, a really small child, we might remember a country very divided also. The war divided us. We had urban cores across America burning, I think including Minneapolis at one point. And the divide was so bad, of course, that a president, his brother, and a civil rights leader were all assassinated. I just point that out to the fact that there was this point, which we sometimes forget about, that we were in a far more ugly, violent, and divided country than we are now. And that even though I know we've had lots of stories about let's say, various violent groups in our society, it still is far less than it was 60 years ago. But the way that I try to get people to think about American politics, and also I'm going to say this parallels with Minnesota too, is to think about the United States from roughly the 1970s to the present. And this is going to be important. And if I were to go back to the 1970s, and I were to, let's say, do a public opinion survey, and at the time it would have been like Harris or Gallup or one of the, Roper, one of the major survey research companies. And we were to ask people the major questions of the day about social issues, taxes, I don't know, I guess the Cold War, a variety of different things, and plot the responses on a curve where we plotted from the most liberal to the most conservative, or most conservative to liberal. We would get a nearly perfect bell curve. And the reason why I mention that is that what we knew back in the late 1970s is that the vast majority of the American public, in terms of public opinion, was towards the center. Now, I'll teach you a couple of political science words today. If I were to take that bell curve and draw a dotted line right down the dead center, we would call that the median voter, because half the voters would be more conservative, half more liberal. So we'd have this bell curve where most of the voters converge towards the center. And this is important for an incredible number of reasons, of which you'll eventually see when I contrast it to what we look like today. So with most voters in the center, I'm going to invoke, and some of you have heard me speak before, have heard me invoke one of my heroes, Willie Sutton, the bank robber. And Willie Sutton, when asked the question once, why do you rob banks? He responded, because that's where all the money is. And the reason why I like invoking his logic is that, and all of you, are elected officials, you understand what I'm saying here, is that if the vast majority of the voters are in the center, where do you want to be as a candidate? Toward the center, because that's where the bulk of the voters are. And back in the late 70s, with public opinion converging towards the center, very few liberals, very few conservatives, the two major parties nationally converged towards the center and produced more centrist type of candidates like Jimmy Carter's and Gerald Ford's to run for president. We also knew back then that the two major political parties, again, teaching you another political science term, were more coalitional and less ideological. And by that, the two parties would both have a mixture of what moderates, liberals, and conservatives in them. I mean, think back for those of you who might know something about or following politics for a long time. We would have had a Democratic Party nationally that would have had a Jimmy Carter as a centrist, maybe a little to the right, a Ted Kennedy liberal, and I'm forgetting who I'd fit into my category as probably a Southern Democrat who probably bordered on being a racist back then, but some pretty conservative people. In the Republican Party, we would have had a Barry Goldwater conservative. We would have had a David Durenberger liberal or a Nelson Rockefeller liberal. And so the parties were ideologically mixed. And that ideological mix was good because it meant that there was enough people in each party that you could reach more agreement on. Two other characteristics that I'm going to get us to the present in terms of how the map has changed quite a bit. The other thing that we knew back at the national level, again in 2020, or not 2020, I'm sorry, about late 1970s, was that about 1/3 of the U.S. House of Representative seats, and remember it's 435, about 1/3 or about 120 of them came from swing political districts. That is districts that in any given election could vote Democrat or flip Republican because the districts were about evenly balanced. What the number of voters who said, I identify Democrat, I identify Republican. And there was about maybe 10 or 15% of the voters who were kind of, well, swing, they could go one way or the other. And these swing districts were important because they were the drivers of political compromise. And that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans could drive their own ideological agenda on their own, and they needed these swing districts. Finally, in back at that era, late 70s, 10 to 15% of the voters we would classify as swing voters. That would be voters who might vote for, let's say, Republican for president, Democrat for governor, et cetera, or one election vote Democrat, one election vote Republican. Okay. Why is all this important? Because we know if we map this out, we would find that at the national level, and again, it was mirroring even in Minnesota back in the 70s, we would find that there was a high degree of political consensus among the public, a high degree of political consensus between the two parties. Most legislation was bipartisan, and we had, if productivity means anything, a high percentage of the legislation, rather I should say, a lot of legislation was actually being adopted at that point. That's our map then. Now, fast forward us to 2020. Something has dramatically changed. I like to tell the story a little bit by saying I moved to Minnesota from New York in 1986, just as Rudy Perpich was running for another term for governor. And I came out here to see a pro-life Democrat get elected to the governorship. 4 years later, I saw a pro-choice Republican, Arne Carlson, elected to be governor. And I say to people, can you imagine today a pro-life Democrat or a pro-choice Republican getting elected to anything? The person wouldn't get the party nominations. And this speaks to something that has happened in American politics and Minnesota politics over a 40-year period. Take that bell curve that I described to you before. I'll give you 3 ways of envisioning it. Envision one, if I could somehow put my foot on the center of the curve and push the center down, and it kind of pushes the humps out to the side. A second description is to say that this is a double hump camel's back, or third, the most technical way of explaining it, it's a bimodal curve. American public opinion and Minnesota public opinion is now bimodal, that it goes up on one side, comes down towards the center, and goes up on the other. And this is significant, that even though about 1/3 of Minnesotans and about 1/3 of national public says, oh, they're not a member of either, we're not a member of either political party. We know that we've become so partisan, so polarized, that there's a fixed view. Very few of us depart from voting along a party line, or very few of us depart from voting in a certain way. A lot of us want to say we're moderates, but we really have sort of reached a position of where we're voting. The percentage of the real population that's in the center has gone down in terms of moderate. If I'm applying Willie Sutton logic about saying you rob banks because that's where the money is, does it make sense for political parties now to nominate people who are in the center? It does not, because the center has disappeared. Instead, what it makes sense to do is to nominate candidates who are closer to where the center of the two parties are. And the center of the two parties have moved further and further apart over time. What has also happened is that the two parties have purified. And by that, we've gone from a point in which we were coalitional parties to now what? We are ideological, where we have, as I pointed out before, very few people who don't toe a party line in one direction or another. We also saw at the national level the move over the last 40 years from 120 swing seats to barely 60, which means we're looking at only about 1/6 of the seats are truly in play in any election. And the number of swing voters has gone from 10 to 15%, to some people saying 5%, to others saying it may be 0. There may be no more swing voters in the United States anymore. That what we're at a point is where American politics is not about whether you're going to swing from one party to another, but instead, what are we going to swing in and vote or swing out to vote? Minnesota, we have a similar picture now. We're down to a point where I'm going to argue that in the Minnesota Senate, we have probably no more than about 9 seats that are truly in play in any election. The rest of them are clearly going to one party or another. And we probably have no more than about 15 state legislative seats that are truly in play at this point. So we have really sorted ourselves out at the state level. Okay, what does all this mean? A variety of different things. I'm going to give you several different pictures of this in terms of how divided of a country we are. What it really means at this point is that we are partisanly divided. We know at the national level that in voting records, the most liberal Republican votes more conservatively than the most conservative Democrat. We know that very little legislation is bipartisan. Productivity has gone down. We're seeing a similar pattern in the state of Minnesota also. We've sorted ourselves out. We have sorted ourselves out, not just politically, but in a whole bunch of other ways. That we live in a world now where Democrats and Republicans not only vote differently, of course, but we also heard about, of course, sort of the great Fox News versus MSNBC split, but it goes even deeper. Democrats and Republicans live in different neighborhoods, shop in different stores, go to different restaurants. One of the things that I like to point out here also, and not in a good way, is that if I were to take a map of the United States and look at areas that vote Democrat versus Republican, and then take that map and plot the locations of Whole Foods grocery stores, Chick-fil-A restaurants, and Cracker Barrel restaurants, I would get a nearly perfect predictor of how American politics votes. My whole point is, think about how partisan we are. We are so partisan that during the election this year, guess what? Our election was divided over all range of issues. Whether we like Trump or dislike Trump, whether we're Republican or Democrat, colored our views on the pandemic, on the economy, on George Floyd, the incidences surrounding George Floyd. All of this partisanship is important to understand in terms of how divided we are as a country. Okay, I'm going to come back to this theme. Second, the 2020 elections are not, actually I should say, we entered as divided nation. I want to say a few more things here. We entered as divided, and I also want to point out about how divided we exited this election here. To think about it on a various scores here is that we entered very divided, ending it's also divided. Yes, Joe Biden won the presidential election, won it by 6 million votes in the national popular vote. But if we get down to the electoral college, Guess what? Shift less than 100,000 votes and across just a few states, 4 states, and it would be what? It would be Donald Trump who had won the Electoral College. Much like 4 years ago, move 85,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and Secretary Clinton would have won. Again, at the federal level, what we're looking at is how depending on what happens in about a month, either the US Senate will be what, 50-50, or it could be some variation very close where Republicans and Democrats are closely divided. The House of Representatives is a narrower margin than it was before. Nationally, before the election, Republicans had about a 51 to about a 48.5% margin in terms of control of state legislative seats. They more or less keep that at this point. At the state level in Minnesota, we entered this election as the only state in the country with a partisanly divided state legislature in terms of one chamber controlled by one party, one by another. We exit this election as the only state in the country with a partisanly divided state legislature. We entered this election with what? With a 5-3 in terms of congressional delegation, Democrat versus Republican. We're now 4-4. On so many instances, we are that close. We are that divided as a country. And the 2020 elections are not yet over, but close. And so I'm looking at the names of people who are here, and I saw Melinda here today, so I'm going to pick on Melinda for a second because I haven't had a chance to talk to you in a while here, and point out and say that when I talk about the elections being close, and you'll see where I'm going in a second here, I don't mean about the president's litigation. Largely, the litigation we knew was going to fail. As of right now, I think post-election, the president and his team are about 0-34. The chances of an election showing widespread voter fraud, we knew didn't exist. We knew that it's very hard to change the outcome of a statewide election with recounts. We generally know, as I point out to people, that usually even though election day is the first cut at an election, we still have to wait until the canvassing board certify. In presidential elections, we still have the electoral votes go on. And so in that sense, the elections is still not quite completely over, but also the fact that we've got 2 Senate races in the United States in Georgia that have to be decided, and they're for all the marbles. And what I mean by that is that it's 48-50 right now, Democrat, Republican. If the Democrats pick up both of those seats, it goes 50-50. And if that happens, Kamala Harris, under the Constitution, who will be our next vice president, gets to break ties. 50-50 if it goes is not much of a working majority to work with at this point. Even if the Democrats get that, the filibuster rule still exists at the national level for the Senate. That's not going anywhere. Joe Biden's ability to move very much is not going to be great. And at the other argument here, if that the Democrats don't go into the majority of the Senate, it's divided government again. And again, I don't see a lot of major legislation being passed. And then at the Minnesota level, the fact that the Democrats didn't take control of the Senate, it means what? A divided government there, and perhaps also a little bit of the same what we're going to see again, what we saw for the last couple of years. And so on one level, kind of anticipating my predictions for 2021 and beyond, we're going to see a lot more stalemate or gridlock, or at our best, checks and balances than before. But the point I wanted to get at here about Georgia, about 2 weeks ago, I was making an argument and I said, well, given the fact that the 2 races in Georgia are for all the marbles, I said, I bet there'll be $100 million spent in those 2 races total in the next few weeks. And I talked to a friend of mine down at the University of Georgia in Athens, and I said, it's going to be $100 million in the race. And she laughed at me. And I said, why? She said, there's already been $140 million in ad buys purchased. And she said, we anticipate $250 million in advertising down there. So this is the part where I would turn to any of you here and say, Melinda, you and I are in the wrong game. We need to quit our day jobs, go down to Georgia and sell television advertising on commission. That's where all the money is at this point. But that just just speaks to how divided we are, that it's coming down to 2 seats that matter. Okay. With that, let's shift to the next point, polling and prediction machines. And I'm going to tell you a conversation I had with a state legislator about 4 days before the election this year. This person called me, and happened to be DFL, and said, "Oh, we're going to take control of the Minnesota Senate, and we're going to have about 36 or 37 seats in the Minnesota Senate." And she said, "We have estimates that we're going to have close to 90 seats in the Minnesota House of Representatives." And I said to this person, "Well, what's the basis of you making those arguments in terms of those predictions?" And the person said, "Well," I said, "Did you have polling? Did you have any? What's your hard data to tell me that you're going to be in those numbers here?" And this person said to me, "Well, no, we don't have any of that. But we've been talking to one another. We've been doing a little bit of door to door, and that's where we think we are." And the reason why I tell this story is that it speaks to, I think, one of the big problems that we saw this year is that lots of people were making guesses about a variety of different things without a lot of good evidence. And a lot of people are criticizing this election again for the fact that they're saying the polls completely blew it and missed everything. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think the polls were actually anywhere near as bad as some people think they were. 4 years ago, the polls were actually dead on accurate in terms of saying that Clinton would win by about 2 or 3 percentage points nationally, plus or minus about 3 points margin of error. They were largely correct. At the state level, if you tracked them over the last few weeks, they were largely correct back then. The polls actually were pretty close. This year, what's been amazing to me, and it speaks to the prediction machines, it speaks to the polarization, is that the polls largely stabilized at the national level about 6 months ago. About 6 months ago, Joe Biden opened up a lead of about 5 to 6 to 7 points in the popular vote over Donald Trump. And he never lost that. Some polls gave him a little bit more, some a little bit less. Many people like me were saying that Joe Biden would probably win by about 5 or 6 million votes in the national popular vote, and that's where he came in. And to a large extent, I think on one level, the polls performed reasonably well. But I mention all of this is because there were so many polls being done. So many of you, again, were probably looking at Nate Silver, 538. Probably were looking at Rasmussen reports or Real Clear Politics and trying to sort of, gauge what was happening, in terms of the elections. And one of the things that we know is that there are some polls that are just not good, polls that are just bad. I mean, I always talk to my students and say, never read the poll numbers until you read the methodology first, how many people they surveyed, et cetera, and then decide if you want to read the poll, because so many of them are bad. We also know, besides some polls being bad, that polls are not supposed to be predictors. They're supposed to be snapshots in time and not predictions of the future. We've misused polls for that purpose. And even if we accept all that, people like Nate Silver and that their methodologies largely were based upon what? Homogenizing lots of polls, good and bad ones together to make predictions. And that just is not a good methodology in terms of doing things. And so I mention all this is that much like in 2016, where I thought the problem wasn't the polls per se, it was the analysts and people being caught by confirmation bias or by cognitive dissonance or implicit biases and saying certain things can't happen. I think we saw the same thing here, but nonetheless, polling is facing a challenge now that we know very few of us who still have landlines pick up our landlines anymore. No one picks up their cell phones anymore. Everybody's, you got to text them first before you can call them. I know with my students, they never pick up a phone for anything anymore. So we have to be rethinking polling in the future anyhow. All right, so go to my next point, which is the unfolding. If the election unfolded in ways entirely predictable. Some of you have heard me talk about the fact that a few years ago, Stacy Hunter Hecht, who used to teach at Bethel before she passed away, Stacy and I did a book back in 2015 called Presidential Swing States, Why Only 10 Matter. And what we argued is that because the presidential election was about what? The Electoral College, because in 48 out of 50 states it was winner take all, and because some states had way more Republicans or Democrats, it was uneven balance, we could make a pretty easy prediction and say that going into 2016, the election was over in 40 states before it started. We knew what was going to happen in New York, California, Texas, Massachusetts, Louisiana. So we thought that in the race to get to 270 electoral votes, only 10 states mattered. And in those 10 states that mattered, which were the swing states, what was in play was about 10% of the voters. So we thought then 10% of the voters in 10 states would determine who gets the 270 electoral votes. Well, last December, I had to start thinking about a new edition of my presidential swing states book that would come out after the 2020 election. So this is true. So it's a year ago at this time, I sat down and said, all right, what's the presidential election going to look like in November of 2020? It was easy to say that Donald Trump was going to keep Mike Pence, so we knew that was going to be the ticket. I guessed at that point and said, odds are it's going to be Joe Biden, more likely than not. And Kamala Harris was the easy pick for vice president. Everybody knew it was going to be her well over a year in advance. So it was a Biden, Harris, Trump, Pence ticket. I looked at it in December of last year, said, that the presidential race was over in 43 states, that Joe Biden would start with 222 electoral votes, Donald Trump would start with 205 electoral votes. There would be 7 states that had a total of 111 electoral votes that would decide the election. Those 7 states would be Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those were going to be the 7 states that I said that were going to be the focus of the entire election. Additionally, I speculated and said because Barack Obama had won Omaha in Nebraska back in 2008, Nebraska is one of the 2 states that doesn't do winner take all. I said, well, perhaps Biden would have a chance of winning there. And then I thought maybe outside chance that Georgia might be in play. Didn't really think it would be, but I said, let's throw that into the table of contents also. But basically, I had about 7 states. And what we had also learned is that within each of the swing states, there are swing counties that drive elections. So, for example, in places like Michigan, it's Oakland and Wayne counties. In Wisconsin, it's a place like Milwaukee and Dane County. In places like North Carolina, it's going to be Wake County. In Arizona, Maricopa County. These are counties that are decisive for a variety of reasons. We know candidates campaign there. And so what we eventually argued, or I started to argue, was that this election would come down to what? A set of 4 numbers: 10, 11, 7, 270. 10% of the voters found in 11 counties across 7 states would determine the 2020 presidential election. In real numbers, I said, we might be looking at numbers that are far less than 100,000 people that really matter, speaking to what? The degree of polarization in American politics. And guess what? The election largely came down to that. The general election from roughly Labor Day until about the first or second week of October, the campaigning focused in on those 7 states, and then it reduced down for about 2 more weeks to the 3 states that mattered 4 years ago: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And then in the closing days, it reduced itself down to what? Pennsylvania. All of this entirely predictable. Now, I know that somebody, let's see, like Mary Jo, I'm looking at some of my friends here today, will say to me, so Schultz, back last December, you couldn't have factored in the economy, the coronavirus, George Floyd. None of that happened yet. And you're absolutely right. But guess what? None of them mattered. At the end of the day, the data is starting to suggest that none of those changed public opinion very much because people's minds were fixed already, and how people perceive those incidences all were partisanly driven. And if we think about this, what this election was always going to be about was one thing and one thing only: Donald Trump. 4 years ago, when it was Trump versus Clinton, it was basically a referendum on Hillary Clinton's character, and that's in part why she lost, at least in the few critical swing states, although she did win the popular vote. 2 years ago, as is typical in midterm elections, it's what? A referendum on the president and the president's party. And what happened is that the president didn't do well. It wasn't thought of very well. And this election, when a president runs for re-election, it's always about them. It's always about the president. And so we knew it was going to be about that, about him. And what happened then is that the coronavirus, the economy, and George Floyd, and I break George Floyd up into three separate things: his death, the peaceful demonstrations afterwards, and the rioting that took place afterwards. All those things were what? Placeholders or surrogates for how people viewed Donald Trump. That at the end of the day, it speaks to the partisanship and the polarization that we all know is still there. The wearing of masks or not wearing of masks, the opening or closing of businesses. All of this, again, speaks to that powerful, powerful divide. And so we have evidence that those issues were all viewed through a partisan kaleidoscope or lens, telescope, microscope. I'm not sure what metaphor I'm looking for here. And that they didn't change basic public opinion. The only thing that really did matter was the fact that what? That the coronavirus led to an unprecedented surge in early voting. Prior to 2020, about 25% of the voters nationwide were voting before Election Day. The pandemic accelerated that, as we now know that we had over 60% nationwide, and I can't remember what the exact figure was statewide in Minnesota now, in terms of percentage of population that voted early. And that changed the dimension of the election, because the president was sharply critical of early voting, claimed it was fraudulent, claimed it was corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. It dissuaded Republicans from voting early, but it encouraged Democrats to vote early nonetheless. And what we could see, again, fitting into my theme of entirely predictable, was that unlike 4 years ago, where Trump didn't win because there was a surge of Republican voters, but because Democrats stayed home in critical places, this time the early voting, requests for absentees and turning in suggested a huge Democratic turnout that was going to occur. And especially what we were going to see is something really critical. Again, some of you who heard me speak before have heard me say that the single most important voter, the most important swing voter in America, are college-educated suburban women. What they do determines everything. In 2016, they stayed home. Trump did well. In 2018, they turned out to vote. The Democrats did well. This election was about the mobilization, first, of college-educated suburban women. 2, it was going to be about people under the age of 30. 3, people of color. Those were going to be the swing voters for the Democrats. And there was evidence they showed up in earnest and voted early. For the Republicans, the core base for the Republican Party was what? White working class, non-college degree individuals. In fact, even better, white male non-college degree people. We could say that this whole election potentially came down to what? The mobilization of college-educated suburban women intersecting with the turnout for white non-college educated males in terms of how they would turn out in 3 critical states. In real numbers, we're looking at an incredibly small number of people that might have mattered for the election. But nonetheless, Trump was saying, I don't like the early voting. And this became important because in the early voting, especially in what? Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, by law, they could not count the absentee ballots until after the election ended. So think about election night. You were probably watching election night as I was. I was working radio and did some television that night. Early returns come in, and it has in Florida, Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia. Biden's off to an early lead. If you're a Democrat, you're uncorking champagne. If you're a Republican, you're uncorking Pepto-Bismol. You're worried. Then the numbers shift around and Republicans feel better. Democrats are a little worried. Then later in the evening, it becomes what? Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin are going for Biden. Again, the same thing. Democrats uncorking champagne, Republicans uncorking more Pepto-Bismol. And then it flips again. About 12:30 on Wednesday morning, 1 o'clock, Democrats are getting kind of depressed, thinking they've lost this election. And Arizona comes in, and it looks like it's flipping to the Democrats. Now the story shifts. Over those next 4 days, 3 days, as the absentees get counted, we see the numbers shift. And again, the story from there that all of you know is how it then put Biden over the top, largely getting us close to where the public opinion polls were suggesting before the election that it would turn out. All of this is by pointing out what? All of this was entirely predictable, and we could see it. We could see this in advance of the election. Again, speaking to how divided we are. Okay, so wrap up here. Give me a couple minutes here, and then we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. Is that where does this all put us at this point? Is that it's really kind of fascinating now. Like I said, that despite any last-minute legal maneuvers, the electors will cast their electoral votes on December 14th. It will be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in terms of being elected. We know at the national level that what Joe Biden has said at this point is that his top 3 priorities are first, getting control of the pandemic. Now, he has talked about, if you saw in the news yesterday, a national mask mandate. I'm not sure he has the authority to do that, but he can certainly use the bully pulpit to try to encourage us all to wear masks. Second, there's the talk of a fiscal stimulus bill, a pandemic relief bill that's going on. At this point, we obviously don't have any clear indication of particular legislation in it. And for all of you here, the question was, of course, going to be, is it going to have relief for local governments? We just don't know yet at this point, whether it's going to target businesses or if it's going to target individuals or some combination of both. We know also at this point that the Senate and the House, U.S. Senate and U.S. House, seem to be stumbling towards trying to do some kind of $900 billion relief bill. They've got until late next week to do this before they go on, basically before they adjourn, sine die at that point until next year. It's not clear what they're going to come up with in that bill. And again, I don't have all the clear details at this point regarding how much, if any, is going to go to local governments, but I don't think there's going to be very much there whatsoever. So that's not going to help out. Other things that we know is that Biden is saying that he wants to be ready to sign a whole slew of executive orders come January 20th to reverse many of the executive orders that Donald Trump signed, which I will say reversed many of the executive orders that Barack Obama signed, et cetera, et cetera. And we can talk about that. But the other thing that's fascinating at the national level is that, the new Congress gets sworn in on the 3rd. The Senate elections, U.S. Senate elections for those 2 runoffs are not until the 5th. So we've got some play here, but then the president doesn't take office until the 20th. Generally, that's kind of a dead period. Joe Biden has been talking about wanting to negotiate with the new Congress during that time period to be up and running on January 20th. Essentially, he's going to have what? It's going to be a shadow presidency for approximately 17 days, which we've never had before. And then finally, at the state level, it doesn't look perhaps quite as grim as we thought it did a few days ago. The state came back and said that we have, and I'm going to call it an illusionary $641 million surplus, reversing what the projections were earlier in the year. The reason why I say illusionary, $641 million on a $50 billion budget is what? Barely 1%. That's frictional. Fiscal forecasts in the course of a year in Minnesota oftentimes vary to up to 5%. So it could change again between now and February. And on top of which, if you folks still remember, we still have the law in place that says for making the fiscal forecast, we count inflation for the purposes of revenue, but not for obligations. We don't have a real surplus. But having said that, the governor and the Republicans and Democrats seem to be groping towards or lurching towards, or whatever it is, I'm not sure how serious this is, some type of, again, relief bill. You folks may have a better intuition than I am regarding whether or not it includes local governments. I'm not sure it does at this point either also. So that's my sense of where we are in terms of as a result of the election. There's a ton of more stuff I could talk about, but I want to leave us with about, what, 13 or 14 minutes here to pose questions. And I know there's a couple in the chat here. Let me look at here. Again, we led the nation again with voter turnout of 79.956%. Now, I can't remember if this story appeared in the newspaper. There was a reporter from the Star Tribune that called me a few weeks ago. I think it ran, if I missed it, let me know, that Ramsey County broke 80% in terms of voter turnout, and we had one of the highest voter turnout rates for any county in the United States. And so I think the story ran, if someone did, just let me know here. So we should take really good pride in the fact that if we're not the highest in the country, we're one of, like, the small handful that are. Okay, as an educator who teaches ethics, what are your thoughts about the push to appoint new Supreme Court justice prior to the presidential election? To me, the big problem was, how do I want to describe it here? It was the hypocrisy of what we saw from 4 years ago. Is that 4 years ago when Scalia died in what, February of 16, and the argument was made in the Senate, well, we can't replace him until after the election. Okay, I don't agree with that, but if that's the rule, that's the rule. I mean, here it turned out to be what, a rule of political convenience, and so that was the part that bothered me a lot. The other part that bothers me as somebody who teaches in law school is the degree to which it's now looking like what, increasingly the Supreme Court is looking more like a bunch of politicians with robes, and I worry about that in terms of undermining our respect for the judicial institutions. Some of us on Zoom are local nonpartisan city council school boards. Any thoughts on the future of historically valued nonpartisanship in these local races? I hope we can keep them as nonpartisan, but as you know, the pressures to nationalize our elections are becoming incredibly powerful now, where from the top all the way down. I used to say for a long time that a local school board race was not at all affected by what happens at the national level. I've increasingly gotten that wrong and have to concede that it does. So two answers here. One of them is, again, I mentioned to you at the beginning, I used to work as a city director of planning, zoning, and code enforcement. In the old days, I used to say that I could run for city council anywhere, or mayor anywhere in the country. And if I ran on the issues of what, streets, sidewalks, roads, parks, fire, police protection, the basic stuff, that's the staple of local government. And what's happening now, I worry, is that people aren't making decisions about local council races or local board races anymore on those basic issues, that somehow we've nationalized them, where we're expecting local politicians to now talk about world peace or world hunger or something. And not that those are not important issues, but I worry about that. Now, the other thing, I don't know if I could, since I'm teaching at home, I've got my school props here. I've got my magic wand here. I actually wouldn't mind it if we went back to the old rule that we had in Minnesota till the 70s, and we also had nonpartisan state legislative elections too. I think when we had judicial elections that were nonpartisan, state legislative elections nonpartisan, and all the local races, which were at least theoretically nonpartisan, that provided a tremendous buffer against some of the polarization we saw in Minnesota. I'm probably not going to get that. Okay, who do I think will win in Georgia? Frankly, I think my sense is I think the Democrats win one seat, Republicans win one seat. And I'm not just saying that to be like King Solomon-like. I think one of the candidates, I'm forgetting their names now, is stronger. My friend who teaches down at the University of Georgia in Athens, when I called her, I said, my first intuition is that Democrats are going to lose both seats. She said that's her intuition, but the game is changing. You know, Georgia's politics have changed. The turnout in Atlanta is huge. But she also said, this is interesting. She said that that nobody likes somebody out of state coming in and telling you how to do things. You know, we're all parochial. And a lot of Republicans, she said, are getting resentful by the fact that the president is saying that the elections are fraudulent, they were corrupt, which is why he lost. Because a lot of Republicans in the state legislature down there are saying, hey, wait a minute, these elections weren't corrupt, they weren't fraudulent, we got elected fair and square. So she thinks there's a possible pushback there that could work to the Democrats' advantage. It's hard to tell. Like I said, I was skeptical about Georgia flipping this year, not completely surprised, but skeptical. It's possible the Democrats pull both. I mean, but it's just, I don't know. I mean, I'm more and more likely thinking, as I'm thinking more about it, it won't be split 1-1. It might be at the end of the day with straight party line voting. It's either both Democrat or both Republican, but I think it's going to be close. Okay. Would the same states and voters be critical if each state assigned electors proportionally rather than winner take all? And that's what I would like to see, is that I would like to see something more proportional, because across the country, like I gave a talk in recently to a radio station in Chicago, and people were calling in from Southern Illinois complaining and saying that Chicago and Cook County dictate the entire state, that somebody in the Republican areas might as well stay home on election day. And in Minnesota, once you get past St. Louis, Olmsted, Hennepin, Ramsey counties, it's all Republican. And Republicans feel like they don't have a choice either. And we have evidence that the Electoral College discourages voter turnout. So I would like to see that shift. It would change the dynamics in terms of opening up more states where candidates would campaign, and that would matter. So it would certainly make a lot less relevant the research that I'm doing, and that's perfectly okay. Okay, could you talk more about having divided government here? Does it lead more to compromise or gridlock? There's an old book, and it is old, from the 1980s. I think it was by David Mayhew. And he examined at that point divided government and said, you know, a lot of compromise occurs in divided government, and it's not as bad as you think. Well, that was almost 40, I think it was David Mayhew, almost 40 years ago. At a time when I mentioned the parties were ideologically more diverse and people weren't as fixed in their opinions as they used to be. Now, divided government doesn't necessarily produce compromise. One would hope it would, but instead what it seems to be doing is producing incentives that come from your constituents to say that, well, stay firm, stand firm, you know, don't give in, et cetera, or creates the let's wait till next election syndrome. Now, having said all of this, I want to give you a little bit of hope on something about the gridlock issue here, and I wish I knew how to get past this. Is when I described to you that bell curve, what's fascinating about that bell curve, if we then ask the questions differently on a variety of issues, we get different answers. If you ask people what they think about gun control, we're polarized. On the other hand, if you ask people, do you support, for example, a 3-day waiting period, or do you support, regulation? Or not, I don't want to use the word regulation. Do you support, background checks? We get about 80% of the population that says yes. If you ask people the question about, and this is an old one. I remember when I was teaching in the 90s, I used this as an example. Do you think we spend too much, too little, or about the right amount on welfare? 70% say we spend too much on welfare. But if you ask people, do we spend too much, too little, or about the right amount on helping the poor? 70% say we spend too little on helping the poor, 70%. We do have some evidence of underlying consensus that's out there, but this maybe speaks to what I call sort of our prediction machines and our bubbles, is that we've got buzzwords that we use that polarize us. The two parties have an incentive to run against one another. The mass media is fragmented and appeals to different audiences, and the social media is producing bubbles. Somewhere under there, we do have some consensus, and we need to figure out how to talk about these issues in a different way, in a different language, to be able to affect compromise. And now we have a great question here about the effects of Bach and Tomassoni choosing to caucus independently. And this was not a surprise, that the Democrats have been losing the Iron Range, for several years. It's a strong Trump territory now. Remember, for all of us, that used to be solidly part of the DFL, three legs of the stool. I mean, think back to 1944 when Hubert Humphrey brought the Democratic and Farmer Labor parties together, DFL. Now in 2020, what's left of farmer and labor for the Democratic Party? That's gone. Greater Minnesota is gone. On the other hand, I can make a good case now to rename the Republican Party the Republican Farmer Labor Party. That has changed. And so Bach and Tomassoni remind me of Sheila Cascaden 20 years ago down in Rochester. She shifted from Republican to independent to eventually Democrat. I think the same thing is going to happen with Bach and Tomassoni. This is part of the gradual shift of the Democratic Party and that base up there, and of two politicians wanting to survive. And I'm glad you brought up the defund the police one. There is overwhelming evidence that the defund the police was not an effective or smart slogan. Now, I've taught criminal justice in the past, and yes, there are some really good social welfare programs that we can do that address some underlying causes of crime. We could do a much better job in terms of desegregating neighborhoods. We need to do a better job on addressing, homelessness, poverty, and so forth. But the defund the police did not play well in the suburbs or greater Minnesota, and nationally it also did not play well. And again, I mentioned earlier that there was partisan reactions to that, but in general, maybe for some Democrats it played well, but for Republicans it motivated them to vote against some Democrats, and for independents, especially in the suburbs and especially among suburban women, that defund the police movement was not a good slogan and not a good selling message. All right, see, what can we all do to help move us forward? There's sort of two or three things that I'm sort of thinking about today. And I don't know how we do this. When I think about some of the biggest challenges we face right now, one of them is the fact that we need a serious program on civics education in America. My first year students care deeply but don't know much about the political system, and they know it, and they want to know more. I feel like the American public is deeply uninformed. I think one of the things that we as public officials do badly, and we don't do a good job at because we don't have the money, is we don't tell our story about what we do, about how our process works. So that's one. The second thing I don't know how to get past is the social media bubbles and information bubbles that everybody lives in at this point. I've just about reached the point where I'm less bothered by the mainstream media. I still think the NBCs, ABCs, CBS is doing an okay job. It's really sort of the corrosive effect of the social media that I think has really been a major problem at this point. And now waving my magic wand here again, if we could figure out a way of doing a much better job on that civic education, addressing the bubbles that we're in, that would get us, at least in my opinion, a long way towards addressing some of these problems. Certainly not everything, but a long way. All right. Any other questions? I want to be respectful of your time too. Good. A few years ago, there was a bill that would require civics for graduation. Why did something like that not pass in our legislature? That's a great question here. I know there was a partisan divide over that also, but I can't remember. Mary Jo, were you in the legislature when that bill came up, or I can't remember now?
Yeah,
Because
not quite, but I worked on it. I worked on civic ed a lot, but I wasn't there for that.
yeah, what happened? Why did it not go anywhere? You
Because
remember?
they were worried about what the standards would look like. You know, whoever wrote the standards, they were worried that it would be slanted one way or the other of what the standards should say. You know, how many times is this written in the Constitution? Or, you know, they were just worried about what it would look like. But I think they all agree that if you make said part of the standards, that we would focus on it more, and that would be a good thing. So I think they're getting closer to saying that that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
To put
I hope so. I mean, because you're
And can
probably. I mean, I was going to say just quickly here. Yeah, go ahead.
That right now that the social studies standards are in review, and if you want to go on to the legislature and look at that, you can have a chance to get input on what those standards say. And so right now they're in the review, and then next year they'll try to implement them.
All right, and they do have a civic education component to them.
They have some, but I don't know how strong it is.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay.
But I think it's crucial, David. You've been such a champion of it, and I just really appreciate it. Just to let all of you know, the Roseville Area Optimist Club has a civic education committee now that's working on trying to get, you know, more people understanding what government does and what local government does. So it's a good effort.
Yeah, and what I'm talking about here is also something a little bit different than you probably have all received this as local government officials, where, I mean, I used to get like when I was working in local government, somebody would call me and say, my grandmother didn't get her Social Security check, you know, and I'm not the person but I would say, well, listen, I can't handle that, but I would hook you up with like your member of Congress, you know, so I'm not so much worried about those types of issues. What I am is, you know, when I hear people saying things, for example, like I had some students this year say things along the lines of, like the United States is responsible for picking up the garbage and stuff like that, you know, basic functions or process kind of stuff. And process and function is not sexy to teach. It's just not, but it's so important to understand. And we need to figure out some kind of way of getting that across. Because again, at the end of the day, if somebody calls you and says, Grandma didn't get her Social Security check, you're going to help them out. And that's no big deal. That's no big deal. But it's that broader stuff that I think we have to worry about.
David, I'm sorry to break up the
No problem
here for everybody. It's such a good conversation, great questions, great information today from you, David. Also just want to point out that Jennifer O'Rourke put something important into the chat. Hi, Jen. Around the last topic that was talked about with the education chair. So check that out. Thank you so much. We do have the business side of the meeting to get to. I want to make sure I'm being respectful of everybody's time there. Okay. So again, I want to thank you, David, for being part of this. Thank you all for coming. You're all invited to stay, by the way. This is your organization, so it's your annual meeting. We do hope you stay for this next segment, but we want to thank David again for being with us this morning.
Right. If any follow-ups, just send me an email. You know where I am at Hamlin. See you later. Bye.
Perfect. Thanks.